So in Western Europe, in Ireland, what is now Ireland and the British Isles, and Brittany in France, these places where we see the stone circle building culture, about 1,000 years after the stone circles had been built, we see this rise of a religious practice or spiritual practice called Druidism. It continued right the way through until about the 6th century when Christianity came. And then it went completely underground because Christianity had a monopolist agenda. And so it went underground, but it influenced culture in these lands to a great extent. And then with the Enlightenment, as the grip of Christianity started to be loosened and people became more open in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, through that period, people started to become interested again in their pre-Christian ancestry. So there was a whole revival period called the Druid revival period. And then from the 1960s onwards, with the hippies and the environmental crisis towards the 80s and 90s and so on, there was another wave, a kind of Druid renaissance, as it were. So now interest in Druidism is very high, and the best way to express it is to say that it's inspired by the ancient Druidry of the past. But in a way, it's a very modern movement. It's got a kind of recorded, written history of about 300 years, but with roots stretching back into the past from the old stories, the old customs, the old places. That's Druidry today. Now, a lot of young people are interested in it, artists, poets, because it also has a kind of threefold aspect. There are three strands in Druidry. One is the bardic strand, which is the interest in storytelling, in the power of myth and story. Then the ovate strand is the interest in healing and in the natural world, in the power of the moon and the sun and the stars and the trees. And then the Druidry proper is the strand that is involved in the philosophy practice and the ceremonies and so on. Druidry today, in the way that many people work with it, we take a story, we have a story that is actually about the moon and the sun, and we build a whole training, a whole way of developing ourselves with this story. And this story is a very simple story in a way, and it feels very, very ancient. It's about how a goddess eats a young boy and gives birth to him again as the finest poet in the land, who is called Taliesin, the radiant brow. It feels as if he represents the sun with his radiant brow, like the dawn. She is the moon who gives birth to him, and her name is Ceridwen, which means bent white one. So immediately we have this idea of the moon, and she changes. She's a changing goddess. And so she chases him through different animal forms, through the forms of a greyhound bitch, an otter, and then in the form of a hen who eats him as a grain. And they go through these transformations. It's connected with the seasons and so on. So it's a story of a rite of passage from childhood to adulthood, because the boy becomes an adult by the end of the story. But it's also, at another level, a story about how we open to our creativity and the mysterious connection between suffering and creativity. And it's as if with Christianity, the link between suffering and life and our purpose in the world is articulated. Suffering is so much a part of the Christian mythos. But it's created problems in a way, I think, perhaps we could say. With this story, it deals with it in a different way. But it's also a story about death and rebirth, if you like, of resurrection, because this child is born again. That story I first heard from my Druid teacher when I was probably 16. And it stayed with me all my life. It makes me feel that maybe all you need is one story to fire your imagination or inspire you. And it's fed me for the following 50 years. It's called The Story of Taliesin. The story is about how a young boy with an old blind man called Morda is in the forest, and they meet a goddess. In some stories it's an old witch, but it's the goddess Ceridwen. And she commands them to chop wood and store it and look after a cauldron. And of course, a cauldron is another wonderful feminine and lunar symbol as well. She invites them to take care of this cauldron because she is making a brew called Arwen, which in the Welsh it means the blessings of the gods, or inspiration. Arwen was the great thing that the bards, the poets, sought, which was that drop of inspiration. When you are being creative, sometimes it can feel like a kind of elixir. The flow, it's when your ego drops away and you get some flow of energy comes through, and you're painting or making the meal or making the love or writing the book or whatever it is, when it flows through. And this was referred to as Arwen. She found the recipe from the Druid alchemists in the mountains in Wales. It has to be cooked for a year and a day because she's a goddess. She doesn't have the time for such menial tasks. So she sets these two at work and it cooks. It's a long story. That's the beginning of the story. That's how it starts, in the preparation of the brew. As Druids, we go into this story, live through parts of it and identify with the characters. We have the characters' dialogue within our imaginations and within our minds. This provokes, or the idea is it for it to provoke changes in our psyche. That's the thing. These old stories are these bardic tales, if you like, that you find in every culture, are meant as kind of food for the soul. It takes time to hear them, digest them, and work with them. Every full moon, many Druids engage in a peace meditation. We believe that at the time of the full moon, the energies are strong and that there's an influence we can work with. In terms of creative projects, an understanding of the phases of the moon can be really helpful. On a waxing moon, that's the time to initiate projects so they can reach their full potential in the full moon. It's important not to be too dogmatic about these things, but usually if the time is a waning moon, it's not a good idea to start a project. It's better to wait a little while and start it with a waxing moon. And then, of course, in the dark moon, it's a time to really go inside and to receive inspiration in the silence and the darkness. As a practice, we celebrate the solstices, the equinoxes, and the cross-quarter days. So 8 festivals, about every 6 weeks we have a ceremony. There are 4 solar festivals, the solstices and the equinoxes, and then 4 lunar festivals, which are in between. So if you imagine going around, so you have the period, say February the 1st, around February the 1st. The 4 solar festivals are fixed because they are astronomical events, fixed in time. The 4 lunar festivals are much more fluid. Around the beginning of February, you have this season called Imbolc, which is associated originally from the pastoral cycle of when the lambs would be born and the cattle would start to go out. It's also the first beginnings of spring, and they represent this festival. All of these 4 lunar festivals represent both the end of one season, the beginning of the other. So that, again, very appropriately for the moon, they are these 2 things. On the one hand, February the 1st marks the last winter festival, but it's also the first festival of spring, because although February feels very cold and wintry, actually you start to see the snowdrops coming up, and you can feel kind of spring coming up. And then you move around to Beltane, which is around the beginning of May. So the 1st of February is associated with the waxing moon, the first crescent. Then you go around to May, and it's associated with the full moon. And sometimes it coincides perfectly, around that time of the full moon. And that's, if you think about that, that's the last of the spring festivals, but it's also the beginning of summer. And then you go around to what's called Lunasa, around the 1st of August, the last of the summer festivals. And just the first hint, the harvest, they're starting to cut the corn. So you're getting this glimmer of the autumn coming. And it's associated with the waning moons, the cutting down of stuff. And then you go around to Samhain, which is around the 1st of November, which is associated with the dark moon. which is the time of death, of entry into the other world, of the ancestors. It's also the last of the autumn, if you think about it, and it's the beginning of the winter. So in Druidism, every season has 3 ceremonies. And we're very familiar with the influence of the moon for women. What I didn't know was the effect on men too. I found a little detail which I quoted in a book of mine about male periods, about the testosterone cycle in men, which people don't really speak much about. They've done some research that there's a cycle of testosterone in men as well. When the book was published, I was contacted by a researcher who asked me for more information. I said, I don't really have any. I just have this one scientific paper that I found, and this is all I can help you with. And he said, I'm trying to write a book about this, and told me how he discovered he had made contact with somebody who owned a chain of sex shops in Amsterdam, who had one day, out of curiosity, had decided to correlate the takings of the shop with the cycles of the moon. And he discovered that he should keep the shops open all night during the full moon period. And in the dark moon, he could close the shop for several days because the money that was coming in would drop. These were all men spending their money. The Sussex police force did a correlation of the lunar cycles with crime. There's a connection with crime and so on. You have this idea of Terma teachings in Tibet, and you find it all over the place. You find it with the Kogi tribe in South America, and you find it in Druidism too, is this idea that the land teaches you. So that sometimes teachings are literally hidden, like objects are buried, which then at the right moment are rediscovered, and a statue or something that has some knowledge in it. But really, I think what it's talking about is the fact that if you tune in, there's this strange mystery, really, of if you believe that the whole of the earth is sacred and all of life is sacred, then it shouldn't matter where you are. But you know that it does matter in as much as, when you're sitting here, it's going to feel very different if you're sitting on the top of a mountain in the Himalayas to if you're sitting by a river in Africa, for instance. It's just going to be different. And it's as if there's this wonderful diversity of teachings, knowledge, and beauty and life that is almost endless in its variety. And you can be inspired by it and be nourished by it by simply allowing yourself to be open to this. And that's part of spiritual training, I think, is how can I be open to, how can I kind of refine or develop my consciousness so that the everyday chatter of my mind disappears when I want it to, and I can sit by this river in Africa, and instead of worrying about whether my computer's safe in my hotel room or whether I've miscalculated the time of my flight from the airport, instead I can just open completely to being by this river and all the stories of the people who've lived by this river for thousands of years, and all the energy of the stars and the moon that have gone into these rocks that I'm sitting on, and all the life of the fish and the beings and the water spirits that are flying past me, how they can somehow all give to me and I can give to them in return, and I can come away transformed in some way. You find that all over the world. That's the extraordinary thing. In that way, I think you can honor the diversity of each culture and each people, not kind of mash everything together like it's all just one, which globalism encourages us to do, I suppose. You can still honor the difference and the uniqueness of a place or a people, but you can also recognize that it's in some way universal, and that if you couldn't get to this river, you could be sitting by a river in your own country or in another country and be fed in the same way, which is also different.